All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. You are on the Getting Started with STEM and Collaborative Learning webinar. We're going to make this a pretty quick, high-level overview today for those that are interested in looking at kind of what's happening with schools and districts as they get started with STEM and collaborative learning. So if you're already kind of partway down that path, we definitely would love to help with your next steps. But for today, we're going to really be looking at kind of, what's happening across the country and how we can take different approaches in getting started with STEM and collaborative learning, because we get a lot of questions about that. That's me. My name is Emily Cook. Welcome. I am the STEM and Collaborative Learning Specialist with Trox. If you're on the call today, you probably got an invite from your Troxel CDI account executive. If you haven't heard the big news, we've switched over to Trox. That's our new name together. And so your account executive is definitely your best first point of contact if you have any questions, but I'll also leave my information on our last slide today, because if there's anything that you have, any questions that you have specific to STEM or collaborative learning, or you'd like to set up a time to chat a little bit more in depth about your specific program, I would be more than happy to do that. My background is in education. I joined the Trox team a couple of years ago, and now I work really closely with schools and districts as they begin their STEM and collaborative learning programs. And so I'm here as a resource if there's anything that I can do to help support you as you do the same. So today we're going to be talking about kind of why STEM and identifying what some common goals are when getting started with STEM and collaborative learning, how to get started, and then of course questions at the end if you have any. We'll leave a little bit of time for that. Okay. So before we get started, if you are in education, as we all are, I assume, you've definitely heard the word STEM thrown around, and you know that we all have maybe have different kind of understandings of what we're talking about when we're talking about STEM. And so kind of the agreed upon definition would be science, technology, engineering, and math. These are disciplines that are taught in an interdisciplinary and applied approach. So I use the word STEM in this presentation really loosely. A lot of folks kind of think about it as all-encompassing when we're doing engineering projects or technology or learning computer sciences. So I'm kind of using STEM as that big umbrella term to talk about all of those sort of hands-on, student-led learning experiences. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but I just wanted to make sure that we're kind of on the same page when we talk about what STEM is. So the first thing is, when we're looking at integrating a STEM program, is thinking about what our goal is for students at the end. And I always think this little cartoon is so funny. I see you did well in school, but what real world skills do you have? And the poor interviewee says, tests, I can take tests. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that can relate to that feeling of like, oh my goodness, we're spending a third of our year just testing kids on everything that they've learned. And how do we know that we're really giving them the skills that they need to be successful? So I think it's really important to start with the end in mind. What are we hoping that our students will get out of this STEM and collaborative learning experience? And so those goals look different. And one of the things that I do when I work with districts and schools as they're getting started with STEM is we kind of try to identify what are the goals that you're trying to accomplish, because this is going to look different site by site, right? Or district by district. For me, as an educator, when I was looking at starting a STEM program at my school, it was really important for me to look at those personal skills for students. So I was noticing that when we would have them take a test, let's say, we were really lacking in perseverance. A kid could look at a problem and feel completely stuck and unable to move on, or even get started answering a question. I'm sure you guys have been there, where you watch your students stare at a blank screen and not even attempt, right? And so I wanted my kids to become more comfortable with failure and perseverance. And so for me, that was a huge motivation in starting a STEM program. But there's other personal skills, right? Collaboration, critical thinking, and of course, as I mentioned, perseverance. These are things that we sort of hope our kids will gather over the years. And unfortunately, I think it's really important that we that we're actually explicitly teaching those skills to students. Another huge focus is student academic outcomes. So when we're looking at those test scores as a way to measure what our kids know, we spent, at least the district that I came from, we spent a huge amount of time and effort on intervention and wanting to make sure that kids were getting those kind of remedial basic skills, the reading and writing and math. And but there's a lot of research starting to show us now that kids are able to really improve in those basic core content areas through STEM, right? So getting their math through a more hands-on applied approach is actually helping their math, their retention of information, and how they can show what they know. Career readiness, so that's a huge one. If you do any research on why integrating STEM, this is a huge priority. There is just tons of research about the fact that STEM careers are growing at a pace that outpaces all other areas, and that we don't have a pipeline of students ready for those jobs. And so if we can give our students the preparedness to be ready to move into industry right after school, it's really powerful for them and their ability to, make a life for themselves, right? So that's a really huge motivation for some schools and districts. And then lastly, the part that's a personal passion for me is addressing the achievement gap, and just understanding that when I taught kindergarten for some years, I was always really aware of how some students came into school so much more prepared than other students. And there's just something so magical about the way that STEM and all of the disciplines that we teach through STEM, that students really come into school at the same place. There's no 5-year-old that's more prepared to do an engineering task than any other 5-year-old, right? And so it's really a magical kind of time of the school day when kids know that even though they didn't feel like they were good at school the rest of the school day, this was a time that they really feel effective and powerful, and that is really exciting. Just a quick little piece of research that I have seen that talks about what employers say that they're looking for in their employees. And at the top of the list is problem solving. And I always think that's so interesting, and it really resonates with me as a teacher, knowing that, I can spend a lot of my day teaching a lot of information and content explicitly, but my goodness, how, when our students run up against a problem, their pencil breaks and they don't know what to do. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm missing something here. I need to make sure that I have kids that can look at a problem and persevere in solving it, right? It's those practices that are so important. So I know I've talked a lot about research today. I'm just going to kind of put this up. You can peek at it, but some of the STEM learning practices that we see as really common in STEM spaces. So this isn't related to the content, the science, technology, engineering, and math, but the way that we approach teaching those concepts through STEM. A lot of times we're using problem-based learning, we're using cooperative learning, and we're using student-led learning. And I think those three kind of instructional approaches are cornerstones of STEM education, and the research really supports what they do for students, right? That when kids have the ability to work in cooperative groups, it increases their engagement, their achievement, their productivity, their self-esteem, psychological health, and increases their relationships with one another. So my goodness, it's worth it, right? But it takes a shift. And so we I want to talk a little bit about kind of how, right? So there's a lot of great research supporting that this is a good thing for kids, but then where a lot of us get stuck is, oh my goodness, how do we even think about getting started? And I want to just say before I move on that I know some of us think about this and go, well, we don't have any extra time and we don't have any extra money, and so we don't really, we can't really do anything to get started. So I'm going to talk really big picture today about what some schools are doing, and it might feel a little bit overwhelming, but I just want to encourage you that we work all the time with districts and schools that have small budgets or don't have a lot of extra bandwidth as far as staffing, and we still find a way to kind of break these big projects down into little tiny pieces. And so that's definitely, I don't want you to feel discouraged if you think, oh my gosh, this is maybe more than what we can start with right away. Of course, that is normal, and oftentimes we'll start with kind of a 3 or a 5 year plan and then break it down little by little. And I think that's a really reasonable way to do it. So kind of three approaches that we've seen as really common in creating a plan are starting by creating a space. And this doesn't have to be done in any particular order. So some folks decide that that's what they want to start with as far as how to break down their 5-year plan, is they want to start with a space, right? We might hear people talk about maker spaces or STEM labs. Those are really common ways to kind of start with a space. Some folks want to think about STEM integration. So we don't have any extra teachers that can teach a STEM class, so we want to empower our existing teachers to be integrating those STEM instructional practices and the STEM disciplines into what they're doing already in their classrooms. And then a third piece is having those STEM-focused pathways. So having a scope and sequence for how we're going to address teaching some of those specific STEM skills. And so kind of the dream is to be able to do all three of these, but again, we have to think about breaking them down and sort of prioritizing by what's going to make the most sense for your goals and your school and your time and your budget. So we'll talk first a little bit about space planning. One thing that I've seen is really popular and kind of a cool way to think about using a space is, and this could be 2 spaces or it could all be in one. This is an example of one room, but having sort of a plugged space and then an unplugged space. So on the plugged side, that's where students would be doing more of their coding, their robotics, maybe 3D design, perhaps some video and audio production. And then on the other side, we'd have a little more of your low-tech kind of tinkering side of the house, where students are doing a little more building and innovation, and perhaps some engineering challenges. And in this case, like I said, they're in the same room, but they don't have to be. Sometimes people use like a corner of their library to do their unplugged kind of maker space. And then they may choose to have their plugged space be what used to be a computer lab, as a lot of schools move from having their computer lab in carts, right? A lot of us have Chromebooks or, you know, individual student devices. So then we don't really need all those computers in the computer lab. And so we're able to kind of transform that computer lab space into maybe a coding lab, or, you know, the space for the robotics lab. So that's just one idea or kind of example of what folks are doing. When we're thinking about the furniture for those spaces, so I'm sure you noticed in this that this is not your typical classroom furniture, thankfully. It doesn't look like a computer lab anymore. And so we work with schools and districts as they redesign these spaces to be a little bit more flexible. I like this example because it shows kind of all those different pieces in one place. There's some collaborative seating that's on soft seating. There's actually a space for a green screen. There's even a 3D printer. And then I always love these whiteboard walls as a way to kind of gather student collaboration and brainstorming. So you'll see in makerspaces and in STEM labs really a variety of different kinds of seating, active seating, spaces that are mobile. So you'll notice a lot of these tables and chairs are all on casters, on those wheels, so they can move around. They have collaborative spaces and more individual workspaces, and then seating that's high and low. People always ask me what this tower is. This is an additional plug, so anyone that's working at this table can plug in to this charging tower right here. But it's mobile. It's on wheels, so you can move it anywhere around the classroom as kids are working. Oh my gosh, if there's one thing that I hear the most from folks that have already built out a makerspace or a STEM lab, and when they're sharing with me about challenges that they've had along the way, the number one thing that comes up is not enough storage. So I always encourage folks to think about 3 types of storage. You need storage for tools, right? You need storage for your materials. So this is like more your consumable materials. And then you always need charging storage and storage for your kind of robotics or whatever technology that you have. These ones need to be locking and charging, and it helps if they're on wheels because they're generally a little bit heavier. For folks that don't have a space at all, if you don't have a room, makerspace, what I've seen and heard that works really well is to have a closet that has all of your materials in it, and then this cart stays empty, and then when a teacher has a project that they're going to do, they'll go fill up the cart with everything that they need from that storage closet and then roll this into their classroom. A lot of times at schools, you know, teachers will feel like, well, I can just do all those things in my room. But the reality is it's really nice to have extra different kinds of materials for kids to pull from that's not your typical classroom material. So things like coffee filters and aluminum foil and popsicle sticks. When they're doing an engineering or a design challenge, it's so powerful for them to have, you know, just a huge resource wall of things to choose from. And so that's why I always encourage to have encourage teachers to have kind of more to pull from that they can share site-wide. So we'll talk a little bit about the STEM integration piece, and I just wanted to share a few kind of new ideas that we're seeing as really popular in schools right now. One is more on the technology side, the video and audio production. So one thing that we're seeing a lot happening in especially more like middle schools and high school and upper elementary as well is this audio production. So Soundtrap's a really good example, but it's a collaborative software. So it is basically allows students to work together in the cloud, so they can be working on this on their way home from school or once they're home, or they can be working together in the classroom, and they can be recording music, they can be mixing audio, they can also be recording a podcast. And we've seen podcasting really blow up over the last year as a way to really be integrating what you're learning about technology into what we're learning in our core content areas, right? So students are learning from podcasts, and then they're also creating podcasts on their own as a way to show what they know. So it's not your typical, you know, 5-paragraph essay anymore, but really how can we use podcasting to show what we know, which is so exciting. The other piece is the video production, which is, you know, has been popular for a long time in schools, but we're seeing this desire to move towards a more mobile video production studio. And so the Padcaster's been a really great tool that a lot of schools are using. Everything that you see here, there's a teleprompter, there's lights, there's microphones, a green screen, it all fits into this backpack. And that allows you that flexibility so that school, you know, that students can record anywhere around the school. It's not limited to one classroom. Oftentimes I'll see schools, they'll still want to have a single room with a green screen and a desk for recording, but this allows a little more flexibility in addition. And then I just made a note about WeVideo. That is an app that is really powerful and allows for students to do some really cool things with editing and really make what they've created, what they've recorded on their video production, just way more professional and very exciting. It's super intuitive. So it's fun for everybody. Teachers and students alike love to see what they can do with WeVideo. Another thing that we're seeing for you know, as far as integration into the classrooms is thinking about 3D design and printing a little bit differently. So first, the more typical way is that we think about 3D printing as a way to kind of allow students to design, right? So if I am teaching my kids about fractions, then I could have them design fraction bars and print those to kind of show what they've learned. But additionally now, more and more, we're seeing that teachers are bringing in pre-designed lessons and files, and so they're creating their own manipulatives so that they're empowered to be doing even more hands-on lessons. So these are examples of that. This comes from a curriculum that's built for 3D printing, and so the students and the teachers actually aren't doing the design in this case. They just have the files to print, but then it's allowing kids to get so much more hands-on. And so that is a really cool way to kind of integrate what you're learning, or you know, what they're doing in their makerspace lab, where they may be doing the creation and the printing, but then also allow us to use those 3D printers in an additional way. 3D printers are definitely the item that we hear the most that aren't getting used enough, right? So maybe a really excited teacher brought in a 3D printer, that person was the one person that knew how to use it, and then they moved schools, and now the school has a 3D printer that nobody else knows how to use. And so I always just encourage people to think about some different ways to use it, not just for student creation, but also to use as a tool to create more hands-on learning. I'm going to show you this video while I talk. I think it should, you don't need to hear anything, you can just see it. But I wanted to just kind of introduce you to some new ideas around virtual reality, right? Because a lot of people are very comfortable with virtual field trips, but they don't think about what else we can be using our virtual reality for. And so this is an example of a virtual reality headset that has embedded curriculum. So we're using the VR to actually teach the lesson about the Pythagorean theorem. This would be, again, more of a middle school, high school solution. But I just think it's so powerful to think about how we can give our students, again, that hands-on kind of fully immersive learning. And it's wonderful for field trips, and that's something that's always available too. But to be able to really enhance their subject area learning, this particular content even has like ACT, SAT prep lessons embedded in the curriculum, which is super exciting. Someone just asked in the chat box what this is. This is actually called Vative. It rhymes with creative. It starts with a V, Vative. And it is a very exciting product on the market right now. One other thing to kind of enhance the virtual reality experience is that students are having is to have them be creating their own virtual reality, right? So I was just talking to a science teacher yesterday, and she was talking about students learning about different habitats, and so I was thinking how cool that would be for a student to be able to go out and bring their own camera and capture content about a specific habitat, right? There's canyons out behind where I live, and so I could, bring my kids out there and have be capturing that content about those habitats, talk about what animals live there and why and what their natural resources are, and then bring that back to the classroom for students to see. Just far more engaging than sitting back and just watching. I think we need to be thinking about how we're really enhancing learning through this technology. All right, the last little part that I'll touch on is how we're doing a scope and sequence of specific STEM pathways. So over the years, if you've been at all involved in STEM integration in your district or in your school, I'm sure you've seen different random robotics and coding tools get sort of brought in, and people test them out and they like them or they don't like them. But one thing that's been missing, I think, across nationwide is that we don't have a really strong scope and sequence about how tools can build off of one another year by year and what the learning outcomes are that we're hoping for students to get from using these tools. And so I put together, just to share today, a little sample of a pathway. This is not by any means a suggestion that every kindergartner needs to use this specific tool at all. But I think it's important to think about how the tools that we bring in for kids to use are enhancing their learning and how they build off of one another year by year, so that we kind of, like we started this conversation with, we start with the end in mind. So if we know by the end of 5th grade we want our students comfortable with coding and certain skills within coding and be ready to move into text-based coding, then what are we going to do to make sure that they get there? So this is, again, just a kind of an example. I'm not going to dig in too much, but I'll just show you kind of what I'm thinking. So for example, in pre-K or kindergarten, the Cubetto tool gives students a really basic understanding of coding and how we speak to a robot through giving them directions, step-by-step instructions, right? So there's these little pieces, and they each have a different direction, and then this robot gets placed on a mat, and the robot goes the way that the pieces tell them to go. So we're helping students understand we talk to a robot through coding, and that we can tell the robot what to do, and we can adjust. So if I want it to get to a certain place on the mat, I can choose which pieces are going to get it there. I love the Ozobot. This is one that's super popular with a lot of schools, and it's just absolutely one of my favorites because of all the different things that it can do. But it's, again, we can build off of that introduction to coding, and then we can get a little bit more advanced by coding with colors. And if you're familiar with Ozobot, basically there's all these different color combinations that can tell the Ozobot different things to do. Ozobot has really enhanced how their classroom works, and so there's a lot more curriculum that they're providing now that helps with that STEM integration as well. By 2nd grade, we see that students are really ready for that more advanced block coding. They're also more comfortable, or not more comfortable, but we want to involve them with more sensors and really more actions that the robot can do. And so we teach them with Ozobot about how a robot senses, thinks, and acts, and then all of the sensors and all of the different actions really get more advanced with Wonder Workshop Dash, and that's another one that's just been super tried and true in schools. Um, and so they just kind of build off of one another year by year. I like to introduce some kind of, you'll see I kind of move towards some more physical building as we get older in the grade. So Sony Couve, it has a bit of a physical build, a little bit more manipulation, and it's a little bit more challenging as far as the physical part, and then the coding is done with scratch coding, and so they're advancing a little bit from like a basic block to a more traditional scratch coding. In fourth grade, this is just an example, but we had a little bit of introduction with circuitry with Couve, and now we're going to advance that to building our own computer from scratch, stepping up the circuitry a bit, and then there's a lot more scratch coding that can be done more advanced with the Piper. And then little bits are a really cool way to begin to take some of that, all that learning that they've done up until this point and sort of deconstruct it and become more inventors. And so there's some great coding curriculum that they can continue to build off of their understanding of coding, but now they can really be building robots from scratch. They can be using their 3D printer to design the pieces and the circuitry to put that together. So again, not a one-size-fits-all solution, but this is just an example of a pathway that we might put together for a school, also depending on what tools they already have in place, right? So if I'm talking to a school and they already have Ozobot and Dash, then it's really easy for us to fill in those gaps that might be missing. But always starting, number one, with what are our learning outcomes that we're trying to address, what tools are already in place, and then how can we build in a pathway that makes sense. Okay, before I run out of time, I just want to make sure that we talk about professional development because it's probably the most important thing that gets most often forgotten. So no matter what thing you're starting with, which kind of approach you're going to start with, it's really important that we think about what professional development is going to support the implementation. So for example, maybe you're going to just start with a tinkering lab or a makerspace. It would be wise to get all the teachers in the school at least trained up on getting started with makerspaces. How does design thinking play into a makerspace? What are some ways that our instruction is going to change? Because frankly, if the instruction stays the same, just because you have cool furniture, that doesn't really mean that anything's going to change for our students. So we have to look at how we're using that space. For STEM integration, there's some great workshops on how to integrate podcasting, or how to really use virtual reality, or even 3D printing, and how to really align those with what you're doing in your classroom. Oh my, tricky finger today. And then again, for the STEM focused pathways, of course, making sure that teachers are really comfortable with the tools that are being brought in and understand how to create those computer science goals and also integrate it with their own curriculum. So very, very important to not forget about the professional development piece. I think that's, like I said, very often missed, and you can feel it in a school. So it's important that we address those items. Oops. So when we work with you, I've kind of mentioned it as we've talked today, but if you want a little bit more support and you want to have that kind of one-on-one consultation to talk specifically about your school or your district, I'm here for you. This is a little picture of sort of how I work with schools and districts. I just feel like I'd like to tell you that there's no extra cost. This is just part of your working relationship with Trox, or Troxel CDI, as you might formerly have known us. So if that's something that would be helpful to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be more than happy to connect with you. That's my information. I finished us right on time. If you have any questions, I will hang around for a few more minutes. But if not, feel free to take down my information, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you, specifically for your school or your district. And otherwise, that will do it for us today. So thanks so much for being on. I'll watch the chat and I'll watch the question and answers to see if anything pops up. But I look forward to working with each of you. Hi there. The last question I think is just, am I going to send out the slides? I am going to, I will share the slides following this conversation, and I can share a recording as well. I think a copy of the recording will actually come out to you as a thank you for attending, so you'll get that. But Suzanne, I can share the slides with you since I have your email. All right, everybody, I think that'll do it for us. Thanks so much for jumping on. Good to see all of you today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.